On the 5th of July, 1962, in the Algerian port city of Oran, a crowd celebrating independence turned on the European residents still living there. Estimates of the dead from that single day range from roughly 95 to well over 300. Within weeks, the exodus that had been trickling out of Algeria for months turned into a flood. By the end of that year, more than 800,000 Pieds Noirs, French and other European settlers, some whose families had lived in Algeria for 4 generations, had abandoned homes, farms, and businesses to cross the Mediterranean into a country most of them had never actually lived in. Cities like Oran and Algiers, which had been majority European for over a century, lost half their populations within months. The schools, cafes, and churches of French Algeria simply closed. That single week is as good a place as any to start, because it's the moment the French Empire didn't just lose a colony, it lost the argument it had been making about itself for over 100 years, that Algeria wasn't a colony at all, but literally French soil. 3 departments of the Republic itself, no more separable from France than Provence or Brittany. When that argument collapsed, so did a piece of how France understood its own borders, its own citizenship, and eventually its own identity. It took less time than most people realize. From the first major crack in 1954 to the final Sahelian troops packing up their bases and leaving in the 2020s, the Empire France had spent 3 centuries building came apart, piece by piece, in barely 6 decades, and the country has been arguing about what replaced it ever since. By the middle of the 20th century, the French colonial empire was, on paper, the second largest in the world. More than 12 million square kilometers across West and Equatorial Africa, Indochina, Madagascar, the Caribbean, and North Africa. Governed from Paris as an extension of French civilization itself. French colonial doctrine leaned hard on the idea of assimilation. The notion that colonial subjects weren't being ruled over so much as being brought, eventually, into full French citizenship and culture. It was a more totalizing kind of imperial self-image than the British model of indirect rule. France didn't just want to administer these territories. It wanted them to become, culturally and legally, France. That self-image is the reason the collapse hit as hard as it did. When the empire started coming apart, it wasn't just a strategic retreat. It was the unraveling of a national story. The first serious blow landed in Indochina. France had been fighting to hold Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia since 1946, against a communist nationalist movement led by Ho Chi Minh that had spent years building both a guerrilla army and genuine popular legitimacy. In the spring of 1954, French forces dug in at a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu, expecting to lure the Viet Minh into a set peace battle they could win with superior firepower. Instead, Viet Minh forces hauled artillery piece by piece over jungle mountains the French had judged impassable, encircled the French garrison, and after a 2-month siege forced its surrender. The defeat effectively ended French rule in Indochina. Nearly 11,000 French and French Union soldiers were taken prisoner at Dien Bien Phu alone, many of whom would die in Viet Minh captivity in the months that followed. The Geneva Accords that followed in July 1954 recognized Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian independence, splitting Vietnam in the process, and setting the stage for the war the United States would inherit 2 decades later. For France, the immediate consequence was less about Southeast Asia and more about what it revealed at home, that a modern, well-equipped Western army could be decisively defeated by a colonial independence movement. That psychological shock landed in Paris just months before an even bigger fire started closer to home. On November 1st, 1954, literally the same year Dien Bien Phu fell, Algerian nationalists under the banner of the National Liberation Front, the FLN, launched a coordinated uprising across French Algeria. It would become an 8-year war. But while Algeria burned, France's other 2 North African territories went a different way entirely. In 1956, after a comparatively brief and far less violent process of negotiation, both Morocco and Tunisia achieved full independence. The contrast matters, because it shows the empire wasn't collapsing uniformly. It was collapsing according to how hard France was willing to fight to keep each piece. Morocco and Tunisia had been protectorates, administered but never formally absorbed into France. The political cost of letting them go was manageable. Algeria was different, and everyone on every side of the conflict knew exactly why. That same year, 1956, delivered a second, entirely separate humiliation with its own long-term consequences for how France saw its place in the world. When Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, France joined Britain and Israel in a secret plan to invade Egypt and retake the canal by force. The operation was a military success and a diplomatic catastrophe. Both the United States and the Soviet Union condemned the invasion, and Washington's financial pressure on the British pound forced a humiliating withdrawal within days. The Suez Crisis is usually remembered as the moment that confirmed Britain's decline as a global power, but it landed just as hard in Paris. It taught French policymakers a lesson that would shape the following decade's decisions. France could no longer act as an independent imperial power on the world stage without American acquiescence, and holding onto colonial territory by force was becoming a strategy, with a shrinking number of great power backers willing to tolerate it. Algeria wasn't administered as a colony. It was legally 3 departments of France, the same administrative category as any region back in the mainland, and it was home to over 1 million European settlers, the Pieds Noirs, many of them generations deep, who considered it simply home. That legal fiction is what turned the Algerian War of Independence into something categorically more brutal and more consequential than any other decolonization struggle France faced. The war, fought from 1954 to 1962, killed what historians estimate at somewhere around 300,000 Algerians, alongside tens of thousands of French soldiers and settlers. It was marked by systematic torture used by French forces against suspected FLN operatives, and by equally brutal FLN reprisals against civilians and collaborators on the other side. It brought down the French Fourth Republic entirely in 1958, ushering General Charles de Gaulle back to power specifically because only he seemed to carry enough authority to either win the war outright or, if that proved impossible, end it without the country tearing itself apart. De Gaulle chose the second path, and much of the Pieds Noirs community and parts of the French military never forgave him for it. A renegade paramilitary group of Pieds Noirs and military hardliners called the OAS, the secret army organization, waged a campaign of terror against both Algerian nationalists and the French government itself, including at least one serious assassination attempt against de Gaulle. The Evian Accords, signed in March 1962, finally ended the war and recognized Algerian independence. What followed was the exodus described above, more than 800,000 Pieds Noirs fleeing within months alongside roughly 90,000 Harkis, Algerian Muslims who had served as auxiliaries in the French army, many of whom were abandoned by French authorities to reprisal violence in Algeria before eventually being allowed into France themselves, where they were often housed in the same isolated transit camps for years, under conditions historians have described as markedly worse than what Pieds Noirs refugees received. France's president, as recently as the 2020s, has formally acknowledged the state's failure toward the Harkis and promised reparations, a sign of just how unresolved that particular wound remains 6 decades later. While the Algerian War consumed the nation's attention, something quieter and in some ways more dramatic was happening across the rest of French Africa. De Gaulle, having watched the catastrophic cost of trying to hold Algeria by force, made a calculated bet on the rest of the empire. Better to grant independence on France's own terms, preemptively, than to fight a dozen more Algerias one at a time. In 1960 alone, remembered in African history as the Year of Africa, 17 African nations gained independence, including all 8 members of French West Africa and all 5 of French Equatorial Africa: Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Niger, Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, Dahomey, now Benin, Mali, Mauritania, Guinea, Chad, Gabon, the Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and Madagascar among them. 2 years earlier, in a 1958 referendum on whether to join a proposed French community, every territory except Guinea voted to stay in. Guinea's overwhelming vote for immediate independence was punished by France with an abrupt withdrawal of aid and personnel, a warning shot to the rest of the empire about what defiance would cost. By 1960, the calculation had shifted anyway, and France let the rest go on its own terms rather than have it taken by force. That distinction, independence granted rather than independence won by war, is exactly why the story doesn't end in 1962. France didn't walk away from sub-Saharan Africa. It restructured its relationship with it. What followed the formal end of colonial rule in Africa is a system historians and journalists came to call France-Afrique, a dense, often opaque web of military defense pacts, currency arrangements, and personal political relationships between Paris and the leaders of its former colonies, several of which France helped install or protect through direct intervention. The most visible pillar of that system was the CFA franc, a currency used across 14 West and Central African nations, pegged first to the French franc and later the euro, with its member states required for decades to keep the majority of their foreign currency reserves deposited with the French treasury in Paris. Supporters called it a source of monetary stability. Critics called it a mechanism that let France continue setting monetary policy for economies it no longer formally governed, decades after the flags had changed. The human cost of maintaining this system was, at times, severe and not always subtle. Thomas Sankara, the reformist president of Burkina Faso, who pursued an explicitly anti-colonial economic program in the 1980s, was overthrown and killed in 1987 in a coup led by his former ally Blaise Compaoré, a coup widely understood, including by later French governmental acknowledgement, to have had French backing. Researchers studying the period describe a broader pattern in which French governments made clear, repeatedly, that African leaders who threatened French commercial or strategic interests risked being removed, while leaders who cooperated received military protection, foreign aid, and, in some documented cases, direct French intervention to keep them in power against domestic uprisings or coup attempts. For most of the late 20th century, Françafrique operated as an open secret. French troops stationed permanently across the region under the banner of counterterrorism and stability, French companies holding privileged access to resource contracts, and French governments quietly involved, sometimes very directly, in propping up or removing African leaders who served or threatened French interests. It was, in effect, a second empire, run without the cost, the visible occupation, or the international condemnation of the first one. That second empire has been unraveling with startling speed in just the last few years, which is where the 60 years in this story's title actually lands its final blow. Since 2020, 6 coups have swept through the CFA Franc zone. Military juntas in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger expelled French troops between 2022 and 2023, formed their own defense pact called the Alliance of Sahel States, and began openly discussing replacing the CFA franc entirely with a new Sahelian currency. Chad and Senegal followed in 2024, terminating their own defense agreements with Paris. The last French Mirage jets left Chad's Adji Kossi base in December of that year. In just 5 years, French troop levels across the African continent fell from roughly 10,000 soldiers to around 2,000. Senegal's prime minister put the sentiment bluntly in 2025. France, he said, has neither the capacity nor the legitimacy to guarantee African security anymore. Leaders of the departed Sahel juntas have been even blunter, describing the French withdrawal itself as a kind of trick. A joint statement from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger's military governments in late 2024 accused Paris of trickery aimed at destabilizing the very independence movement it was nominally accommodating. As France's military and monetary presence recedes, other powers have moved quickly into the vacuum. Russia's Wagner mercenary network has taken over security contracts in Mali and Burkina Faso, specifically in the space French troops vacated. China has expanded infrastructure investment and financing across the same region, offering governments an economic partner without the historical baggage of a former colonial ruler. Turkey has built its own foothold through military cooperation, education initiatives, and infrastructure projects. Emmanuel Macron himself has publicly declared the era of Françafrique over, a striking admission from a sitting French president about a system French governments spent decades denying even existed in the form its critics described. So, if you're counting the arc of this story literally, Dien Bien Phu in 1954 to French troops finally leaving Chad and the Sahel in the 2020s, you get almost exactly the 60 years this story's title points to. But the more interesting 60-year clock isn't the one measuring French troops leaving Africa. It's the one measuring what came back to France in their place. Decolonization in France didn't just mean French people and institutions leaving former colonies. It also meant, over the following decades, millions of people from those former colonies and their children and their grandchildren arriving in France itself, often specifically recruited as labor for the post-war economic boom the French call Les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of growth after 1945. French industry and reconstruction projects actively recruited workers from Algeria, Morocco, and sub-Saharan Africa throughout the 1950s and 60s under bilateral labor agreements that treated migration largely as an economic transaction, with comparatively little planning for what permanent settlement and eventual family reunification would mean for a country still working out its own post-imperial sense of itself. Algeria alone accounted for the largest single immigrant population in France for decades. By 2018, France's National Demographic Institute counted 845,000 Algerian-born immigrants living in the country, and by 2023, an estimated 2.09 million residents born in Algeria, Morocco, or Tunisia combined. The trio of former Maghreb territories whose independence had opened this whole story. France's Muslim population overall, drawn heavily, though not exclusively from former colonies across North and West Africa, is now commonly estimated at around 5 million people, the largest Muslim population of any country in Western Europe. That demographic shift ran headlong into a French political tradition that had never quite figured out how to talk about difference within its own borders. French republicanism is built on a principle of universalism. The state officially does not recognize race, ethnicity, or religion as categories of citizenship, treating every citizen identically as an individual before the law and the French census, notably, doesn't even collect data on ethnicity for this reason. In theory, that's a deliberately inclusive design. No group singled out, no group privileged. In practice, applied to a population that increasingly included millions of French Muslims of North and West African descent, it produced decades of friction over exactly how much cultural and religious difference a supposedly difference-blind republic could actually accommodate. Some scholars, studying this period, trace the specific shape that friction took directly back to the colonial relationship itself. The same North African Muslim populations France had spent over a century governing, as subjects rather than full citizens, were, within a generation, living in France's citizens, whose religious practice the state still hadn't developed a settled, comfortable way of accommodating. The clearest flashpoint has been laïcité, France's strict doctrine of secularism, treated across the political spectrum as close to sacred, a foundational pillar of the Republic dating to a 1905 law separating church and state. In 2004, France passed a law banning conspicuous religious symbols in public schools, a measure that, in practice, fell overwhelmingly on Muslim girls wearing headscarves, despite more than 40 prior rulings from the Council of State that had found the headscarf compatible with existing law. In 2010, France went further and banned full-face coverings, including the burqa and niqab, in public entirely. Supporters describe these laws as protecting a religiously neutral public sphere and, in some framings, protecting Muslim women themselves from coercion. Critics, including many French Muslims, describe the same laws as a doctrine originally designed to keep the Catholic Church out of the state, being selectively repurposed to police a specific minority's visibility in public life. Then there's the question of the banlieues, the dense, often economically deprived suburban housing estates ringing France's major cities, disproportionately home to immigrant and second-generation French families from former colonies. In October and November of 2005, the accidental electrocution deaths of two teenagers, one of Malian descent, one of Tunisian descent, fleeing what they believed was a police chase in the Paris suburb of Clichy-sous-Bois, ignited 3 weeks of nationwide unrest. Roughly 9,000 vehicles burned, hundreds of public buildings damaged, nearly 3,000 arrests, and a national state of emergency declared for the first time since the Algerian War itself. The riots became a defining issue in the following year's presidential campaign, and echoes of the same underlying tension, economic exclusion, policing, and the unfinished question of what full French belonging actually requires, resurfaced in serious form again in 2023 after the police shooting of a teenager named Nahel Merzouk in the Paris suburb of Nanterre triggered another wave of nationwide rioting. All of this, the unresolved memory of Algeria, the Pied Noir and Harki communities still fighting for recognition decades later, the millions of French citizens with roots in former colonies, and the repeated flashpoints over religion and public order, has fed directly into the rise of France's contemporary far right. The National Front, founded in 1972 and rebranded as the National Rally in 2018, built its political identity for decades substantially around immigration and national identity, explicitly linking growing Muslim populations in France to the country's colonial past in North Africa. Jean-Marie Le Pen's shock advance to the second round of the 2022 presidential election was the first sign that a party built almost entirely on that argument could break into the political mainstream. His daughter, Marine Le Pen, repeated the feat in 2017 and came within roughly 17 percentage points of the presidency in 2022, running on a softened but still recognizably related platform. By the legislative elections of 2024, the National Rally had, for the first time in the party's history, come within realistic reach of actually forming a government, a trajectory that traces in a more or less unbroken line back to the same colonial rupture this whole story started with. It's worth being clear about something here. This is genuinely contested political terrain in France today, not a settled historical verdict, and different sides describe the same underlying facts in very different terms. Some French commentators and politicians describe rising Islamic religious visibility as an active threat to French secular identity, requiring firm state response, and some go further, framing demographic change from former colonies as a deliberate, organized great replacement of the native French population, a claim most professional demographers treat as unsupported by the actual data on birth rates and migration flows, and one that has drawn accusations of promoting a racialized conspiracy theory, even from critics otherwise sympathetic to concerns about integration. Others describe the same demographic trend as an ordinary feature of a diversifying, still fundamentally French population, and describe the political response to it as discriminatory overreach, dressed up in the language of universalism. Both camps agree, even while disagreeing about almost everything else, that France's relationship with its former colonies didn't end with independence. It just moved indoors into questions of who counts as authentically French, what the state can ask its citizens to wear or believe, and how much of the colonial rupture the country is actually reckoned with versus simply relocated. Run the clock from wherever you like. Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The wave of African independence in 1960. Algeria's independence in 1962. And you land, almost exactly 60 years later, on French troops boarding the last flights out of Chad and the Sahel, on a French president publicly declaring France-Afrique dead, and on a domestic political landscape still visibly organized around the unresolved question of what all of that history means for who gets to belong in France today. It's worth resisting the temptation to flatten all of this into a single tidy narrative, because the people living through each stage of it experienced it in genuinely incompatible ways. A Pied Noir family that lost everything in Oran in 1962, and a Harki veteran left in a French transit camp for years afterward, do not share a memory of decolonization with an Ivorian or Malian official negotiating the exit of French troops 60 years later. And neither of those experiences maps cleanly onto that of a French citizen of Algerian descent navigating a 2004 headscarf law in a Paris suburb school. What connects them isn't a shared story so much as a shared root system, one long unresolved rupture that kept resurfacing in different forms, in different countries, decade after decade, because France never fully settled, at any single point along the way, what its relationship to the people and territories it had once ruled was actually supposed to become once the ruling stopped. That's arguably the real substance behind this story's title. France didn't lose its identity in the sense of some single, coherent national self being replaced by another. It lost the settled version of that identity, the one built on the assumption of a civilizing empire, stretching from the Caribbean to Indochina, and has spent 60 years since then negotiating, often through open political conflict, what comes next. Some of that negotiation happened on battlefields in Vietnam and Algeria. Some of it happened in courtrooms and parliamentary votes over what a schoolgirl can wear. Some of it is happening right now in the Sahel, as the last vestiges of the shadow empire that replaced the formal one get dismantled by the very governments France once helped install. None of it is finished. That's really the point. 60 years is not the length of time it took France to lose an empire. It's the length of time, and counting, it has taken and is still taking to find out what it's supposed to be instead.